So welcome to this online viewing room of at Basel, which has merged with the gallery Nielsen and the Superflex studio. So I'm sitting in the Superflex studio in Copenhagen and also in the online viewing room, which can be a bit confusing. I'm sitting in 3 different rooms at the same time, a gallery and a Basel and the Superflex studio. My name is Rasmus Nielsen and I am part of Superflex, which is a Danish based artist group. And I'm here cued by our work that we are presenting in the gallery Nielsen in the viewing room, which I will be speaking of today. It's basically a work consisting of 3 photographs, going by the name of Every End is a New Beginning. And it's a work that takes its starting point, not in this part of the world where I'm sitting now, Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Denmark, Copenhagen, but rather in the South Pacific. And it relates specifically to an island called Hunga Tonga. And this particular island, I would wish could sort of speak and that I could sort of transform into this island, because the island is the topic of these photographs. It's the narrative of the island that frames the story. And it's also a story about an expedition on the good ship Dardanella that we were on 2 years ago in the framework of the TBA21 Academy program called The Current, which I will speak about also in a minute. But first, I'd like to sort of locate this island where the photographs originate and sort of try and explain why it has the slightly cryptic title, Every End is a New Beginning. Now, there are 2 entry points to Hunga Tonga, a small island in the South Pacific. And I'd like to sort of go over these 2 entry points because they are the 2 points that informed us and the expedition which we led to the island 2 years ago. And the first one is an entry point you could say is framed by NASA, the space agency of the Americans, who has studied this island very closely, because this island happens to be the newest island on Earth. It basically was an island that blew up, an underwater volcanic eruption blew up in the South Pacific and created this island just a few years ago. And NASA has been following that process very closely because they say that it resembles the surface of Mars very closely. So the geology and the processes happening on this newest island in the world looks like just like Mars. And it may be a sort of a cue to whether or not there was water on Mars, they say. And that's why they're kind of studying as a piece of, you could almost say, ongoing science fiction. They're studying Mars by studying Hunga Tonga. And this is NASA queuing in. So this is a bit of a sort of science fiction side of the island that we understand, or we try and understand what happened in the past on other planets through understanding Hunga Tonga. The other cue to this island, and the reason why we went there on this expedition, was the fact that, and here I have to go a little bit back in history, that in the 80s, 70s and 80s, I used to live, I partly grew up in the South Pacific. And while visiting a family once in the 80s there, specifically in the Kingdom of Tonga, I was staying in a water tank. And the owners of this house and this water tank, which was in the garden in the back, said that, well, yeah, you can stay here while you're visiting us because there's this other guy, this old man who occasionally stays there, and he's not there at the moment. He's living somewhere else. And then they sort of spoke a little bit about this old man, and it turned out that it was actually an old Danish man. And it is the story of that old Danish man who happened to have lived on Hunga Tonga that also is part of the, you could say, our cue for this expedition to go there. The story of this guy starts in Copenhagen in the 1940s. His name is Preben Heinrich von Kaufmann. And he was an engineer student in Copenhagen, very, very bright engineer student. And he graduated from the Polytechnic Institute of Copenhagen in 1945. And he then heard about the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and came to the conclusion that as an engineer, it doesn't make sense anymore to build bridges and towns and cities because we are anyway going to blow them up in a big nuclear explosion. So he developed this sort of idea that he had to sort of get as far away as he could from what he referred to as Western civilization. And first he thought he would just go to Sweden, to the forest of Sweden, and went for a while there, and they can be quite, you know, rough and off the grid. And from there he ended up on the, because it wasn't really enough, he ended up on the west coast of America. And finally, to sort of reach his, the sort of dream of his fantasies about getting as far away as possible, being sort of closer to the Pacific, and specifically the Kingdom of Tonga, which he had fantasized was probably the safest place on Earth and the safest place to get away from the nuclear bombs as he could possibly imagine. And so he sort of, in the late 40s, slowly made his way through the Americas and out into the Pacific, to Hawaii, and then further on to Tonga in his boat. He thought this would be the perfect place to live and the safest place on Earth, away from nuclear holocaust. And then also the bombs in him had created this idea of that all this technology that he had been studying as an engineer student was irrelevant, and really what he should was to get away from all this technology which he understood as being an evil. So he ends up in Tonga late 40s and lives on the main island, finds out that his skills, engineering skills, are highly appreciated, and starts helping with the engineering of the harbor in the capital of Tonga. Befriends the Queen, actually gives the Queen of Tonga his boat, but then slowly sort of develops a desire to be even more isolated. And the Tongans suggest that, well, there is actually this island about 10 hours away from the capital, out through the open sea, the Pacific, and it's completely deserted. No one lives there because you can't really anchor up there. There's no entry point. It's these sort of rocks and cliffs. You have to swim there when you go into the island. And he sort of says, well, that's perfect. because then I can be there alone. So eventually, Preben ends up on Hunga Tonga, the beginning of the 50s, and stays there for a couple of decades. He is occasionally then visited by people from the capital who, when his engineering skills are needed in the capital, they send the boat up there. It takes about 10 hours, and then he can see the boat in the horizon, and he swims out to the boat. And then he goes to the capital and builds a bridge or a church or some construction where his technical skills are needed. And then, as far as he can, sort of goes back to the island of Hunga Tonga. And we had sort of heard about the story and thought that sort of mix of going to this place, which is also, from a Copenhagen point of view, almost the opposite side of the world. It's quite remote. It's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That this was a place that another Dane had fantasized about as the most peaceful place, the best place you could probably be in safety from all the wrongdoings of human technology. And its sort of climax in the nuclear bombs, that he had actually gone there and lived. And then at the same time, you had this sort of other entry point, which I started talking about, which was the sort of more sci-fi point of view, the NASA point of view of Hunga Tonga, and their interest in the island as a place where we could basically study Mars. So this sort of informed you could say the expedition. It's very difficult to get to this place, but fortunately, we were sort of given this enormous privilege of being expedition leaders in the program called The Current, which is a program run by the TBA21 Academy, where you actually get to do crazy things like this. And you also get to invite people that you think would be interesting and relevant to bring on such an expedition. So we gathered a group. I think we were 19 people on the ship, the Dardanella, and we sailed to this island, and on the island conducted various experiments, documented, photographed, filmed. We made a film, we made these photographs, we made a series of experiments with the people we brought there. And some of these people were actually architects, technicians who work with NASA also, specifically a woman, Barbara Imhoff, who has actually developed theories as to when we start going to Mars, how can we build there? How can we sort of start constructing cities on Mars? And she'd made sort of a technological concept as to how this would be possible, and we thought that would be great to sort of remake this experiment conceived by her on this island, which was also an island closely studied by NASA, to sort of understand Mars further. So there was an interesting link there, and we brought materials to sort of start thinking of constructing building materials using the rays of the sun to melt sand, to build bricks, etc. So on the island, with all these people, various experiments were conducted. Various things kind of went on, and while we were there, strange things started happening, because it's a bit of an island, if you can imagine. It just blew out a couple of years ago, 5 years to be specific, of the Pacific Ocean. There was the old Hunga Tonga island before, and now that blew up, and then new Hunga Tonga sort of emerged, which looks like another planet. It looks like the moon. And it's a landscape that's very hard to understand for a human, in the sense things that appear small are actually big, and things that appear big are actually small. So when you walk around on this small island, you don't really, you get a bit dizzy, and it's completely black. There's no real vegetation as of yet. Probably this will emerge, but not really yet. There's just some birds making odd sounds. And then in the middle of the island, there is a green lake. And in the beginning, when we were there, we didn't really dare to jump into it. But after a while, there was some very adventurous scientists on the expedition who did it. And then we thought, me and my other partners at Superflex, well, it's a scientist who does it, then it's probably okay. But what was surprising then, diving on this deserted island, was that at the bottom of this completely green lake, there was the beginning of, you could say, life. There was life there on this. I mean, imagine like a giant explosion, and then basically life emerging in the middle of this. And the scientists would tell us that this is because there are extremophiles living there, and extremophiles are these bacterial cultures that live around the vents of the Pacific Ocean. It's kind of like, from a scientific point of view, the bank of life, you could say. It's, if we destroy everything here on the surface and in the oceans, potentially the extremophiles would be able to sort of rebuild life from scratch, from the bottom of the ocean. So it's these odd creatures that can live in very, very weird places that are kind of the bank of life. And we found them on the bottom of the lake on Hunga Tonga. So seeing that and being on this island that both is sort of the beginning of life, but also the end of life. And it's an island where you could say the Danish guy who was, after a couple of decades, given a Tongan name as well, TBA21, I think, which means, my Tongan is not very good, but I believe it means the spirit that rises from the sea. But to sort of understand that we were in a place that people had thought of as the most safe place, being so far away from human destruction and technology as you possibly could, but also a place where nature showed itself from its most demonic side. It basically blew up. So in a way, maybe nature was making a point, I don't know, but it was ironic that the island where a fellow Dane had thought this is the safest place to be away from the bombs, the nuclear holocaust, ended up blowing up by itself. So being in all that sort of web of stories and also physically being on the island with this amazing group of people was quite hypnotic, and people started feeling a bit dizzy, and you lost your ability to somehow really measure distance to things, because it was such a out of this world landscape. It was like being on another planet, basically. And out of that process and out of this experience with all these people, with these scientists, with this group of expedition members, several works also developed, including this Every End is a New Beginning, which we seem to somehow feel was an appropriate thematics as to that particular island. I believe if the island could speak, and if it would speak in a proverbial way, it would say stuff like that. Well, humans can be destructive, and so can nature. Islands come and go, and now actually humans get to see the emergence of a Pacific island and at the same time they can study Mars. So these are some of the, you could say, the backgrounds of particular this work, as well as the expedition with the ship, the Dardanella, that we were part of as expedition leaders 2 years ago. I would also say that another thing fueling the interest in this particular part of the world and the framework that the expedition was thematized under somehow has to do with not just the location and the story of Hunga Tonga, but also in more sort of general terms, an understanding of the Pacific Ocean as a vast, endless space where experiments can be carried out and experiments are being carried out. And probably most famous of the big experimental 20th century experiments in the Pacific are the nuclear tests. All the nuclear powers have been testing bombs, a lot of bombs in the Pacific. And you could say probably the understanding of this particular landscape of the Pacific is fueled by this understanding of an endless space where when I say we, I mean people from the West can pretend that we are in a place that is endless. We can blow up our hydrogen bombs, our nuclear bombs, and we can do all the things that we would never do at home. And in a way, the new experimental version of that is called deep sea mining, sorry. And this is basically a new mining adventure, not yet happening, but in a sort of experimental phase where private companies will be starting to dig into the seabed of the Pacific with the aim of extracting minerals and generating enormous amounts of wealth. Of course, this is done in a very problematic context, in the sense of we know what mining has done to other areas of Earth in terms of total destruction of the natural environment. And namely also in a sort of Pacific context, the mining specifics will be most probably around the deep sea vents, which is this sort of underwater boiling, almost like vents in the seabed, where some of these extremophiles lives, which possibly, if we mess up everything on the surface, would be able to regenerate life from scratch. So we are basically, we're fumbling with the very DNA of the world by doing these things. But it's the Pacific, and from a Western point of view, we have conducted and we've understood this landscape as this experimental grounds where we could do what we would never do at home. And that is why also that the expedition to Hunga Tonga that we were on, we called not deep sea mining, but deep sea minding, that it would sort of try and understand this landscape in a different way. We would still be kind of minding its depth, but more on a sort of mental level. So that sort of framed the expedition as such. So these are some of the backgrounds. I think it's understanding the Pacific as a landscape. A lot of things are fueling it. This particular work that I'm here to talk about today speaks to the very sort of specific story of Hunga Tonga, and it's sort of a cue to so many fantasies. Fantasies about other planets, fantasies about the peaceful life, fantasies about escaping your background, escaping Western civilization, escaping nuclear holocaust, and then ending up in a part of the world that is actually in the post-World War scenario, the exact place where nuclear testing was actually going on. And eventually also the island specifically blows up also. So these were some of the specifics that sort of we were interested in. And then maybe I'll speak a little bit about these experiments that we did on the island. More specifically, I have some materials here. I don't know if you can see, but here is a piece of the island that has been sintered. And that is based on this concept developed by an amazing architect, Barbara Inhofe, who worked for NASA, with this concept as to how potentially to start building on Mars. And we did a remake of her concept on the island, which is basically concentrating the rays of the sun through this mirror, or a lens actually, and then melting bricks on site, basically using the energy of the sun. So this is like potentially a little example of how in the future we will be making bricks on Mars. So we were also interested in that from the point of view of understanding, well, not just how to make houses on Mars, but also how should we as humans potentially build in the future, not just on Mars, but also on Earth. And we had brought to the island also building materials that we had sort of constructed with the aim of showing them and understanding other species' reactions to these materials at a time in the world where you could say sea levels are rising, so potentially also human environments in the next couple of 100 years will be submerged, meaning that we are not just building for humans, but also we are actually building, and we know we will be building for other species, and potentially we could try and navigate and understand the desires, the dreams of other species as to what would they want when they start inhabiting our cities. What will a fish think if it's gonna live in the house where I'm living as of now? Could there be preferences that could be translated into materials? And could we even start sort of asking our co-species as to what might they want, what might they fantasize about? So actually what I'm sitting in front of here, this pink structure is a sort of early experimental version of that. It is pink because there are creatures down below the surface who actually have pink preferences. So we, and furthermore also have preferences as to distribution of space. So as you can see, the architecture of this particular structure is full of holes because it actually mimics this, which is a sponge that you can use it in the bathroom. It lives at the bottom of the sea, and it has this very interesting sort of structural composition that we've tried to sort of mimic in these materials, because for various reasons, this particular architecture of all these holes is very, very good for the underwater world. Different species sort of seem to be enjoying this sponge architecture very much. They're very popular sort of residential areas in the sea. And we brought to the island of Hunga Tonga, we brought these test versions in a smaller kind of scale. We brought them there, and in the waters around the island, conducted these experiments. that deals with this sort of every end is a new beginning. Basically, okay, humans will possibly not be living as we've lived until now in the cities where we've been dwelling until now. There will be fish and marine life coming in the next couple of 100 years due to climate change and the rising sea level. And maybe this particular island and its surrounding ocean is the exact sort of right symbolic place to start experimenting with this sort of new beginning, which is not a human beginning. It's basically a beginning of other species taking over our structures. So we took these building blocks, show it again, and made some underwater small constructions, and then with the scientists that was on the Dardanelles, sort of recorded and tried to understand the various reactions of species to this architecture, almost like a kind of a underwater IKEA, where things are being presented, and then you sort of try and understand how do different species react to these structures. So in a sense, the three photographs in the OVR, the online viewing room of Gallery Nielsen at Basel, sort of is all of this is fueled by all of these experiments. It's fueled by this sort of feeling of being in a place which is the sort of end of things. It's a big explosion that created it, but it's also the beginning of something new. So, and it's also, you could say, where this vision of how to get away from the most destructive things that humans have ever constructed, the bombs, the nuclear bombs, as well as the place where nature shows itself from its more sort of demonic side and blows up, basically in a giant eruption and explosion. So there's so many sort of lines and webs of stories that meet on this island, and hopefully the island itself, through these photographs, is also able to sort of tell that, maybe not in a verbal way, but sort of speak to the sort of that there is this weird sense sometimes where what we call the beginning and what we call the end is sort of overlapping, and for us that was very much something experienced by this presence on the island of Hunga Tonga. So I think I'm gonna wrap that up as for now. I have no clue of how long time I have been talking.
We have a couple of questions.
The producers are saying that there are questions.
We got a question about what's the material of the pink.
Yes, this one here is something called, it's made of ceramics. So it's basically ceramics that has been, ceramics in an airtight chamber where gas has been sort of pumped in, and that creates these sort of holes that are a bit like inside, basically the same process that happens inside a bread. And it's very hard to sort of do this mechanically, but it's sort of, the process of doing it in this way creates this this bread-like structure, which is also the case with the bigger structure behind me. This is a metal. It's actually aluminum foam, it's called, where again it becomes this sort of bread-like feature. But it's the very beginning of this, when we started being interested in that, this sort of architecture and sponge-like elements. It started a bit like this, where we actually took sponges and dipped them in various kinds of ceramics and burned it. And that's hardly durable in the end. It was more like on an experimental level. And then it sort of fueled these sort of larger experiments that are in the back of me here.
Okay.
So I think this is, we will be logging out. Thank you for watching.